Welcome to this VCDNP webinar today. My name is Hanna Notte. I'm a senior research associate with the VCDNP, and I'm very glad to welcome you today. We will talk about the nuclear non-proliferation regime today, which, with the Treaty on the Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons, the NPT, at its center, has really been largely successful in preventing proliferation over the last decades. But what is it that accounts for this success, the success of the regime? What role have the policies of major powers, in particular the United States, played in building the regime and also ensuring the adherence of other states in the international system to the regime? And how are shifting global power dynamics affecting the non-proliferation regime today? And what are its prospects going forward? Now, we are very fortunate to have with us today Dr. Rebecca Davis Gibbons, who will address these questions. She just wrote a book about the nuclear non-proliferation regime, which came out a few months ago, entitled The Hegemon's Toolkit, US Leadership and the Politics of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Regime. It was published by Cornell Press. And Dr. Gibbons will discuss these questions with us today. I do want to introduce her briefly. Dr. Rebecca Davis Gibbons is an assistant professor at the University of Southern Maine, where her research focuses on the nuclear non-proliferation regime and the movement to prohibit nuclear weapons. She has published extensively on both the NPT and the TPNW. She was previously a postdoctoral fellow with the Belfer Center's project on managing the atom and international security program at Harvard, and a pre-doctoral Stanton Nuclear Security Fellow at the RAND Corporation. And Dr. Gibbons earned her PhD in international relations from Georgetown University, where her dissertation examined how the United States persuaded other states to join the nuclear non-proliferation regime. And this research formed the basis for her book, which she is discussing with us today. So welcome, Rebecca. In a moment, I'll turn the floor over to our speaker. Dr. Gibbons will talk about her book, after which there will be an opportunity for the audience to pose questions. If you do want to pose a question, please use the Q&A function, which you find at the bottom of your screen. There's also a possibility to submit questions via email to events@vcdnp.org. We have colleagues who will be monitoring incoming questions, and I can then make sure that I see those and read those to our guests. And the last thing I should note is that this webinar today is being recorded. So with that, welcome, and please, I turn the floor over to you.
All right. Thank you so much, Hannah. I want to thank the Vienna Center for Disarmament and Non-Proliferation for hosting this event and allowing me to talk about my book. I also want to thank Carolina and Gauhar for organizing. I love how you said I just wrote it, and I wish that were the case. But like you said, this is a 10 years in the making project. Hopefully next time I'll be a little more efficient. So I'll begin this book talk by going back to March of 1963. And that was the famous press conference with President Kennedy, in which he said he was haunted by the feeling that by 1970, unless we are successful, there may be 10 nuclear powers instead of 4, and by 1975, 15 or 20. This quotation is used a lot in our field to talk about the fear in the early nuclear age about how many nuclear weapons states there would be. At the time that Kennedy gave this press conference, there were 4 states that had tested nuclear weapons, and just 4 months previous, the world had lived through the Cuban Missile Crisis, right? So Kennedy was very aware of the danger of more nuclear weapon states, or imagining what it would be like if we had more Cuban Missile Crises happening. But it wasn't just Kennedy who anticipated that many more nuclear weapon states could exist in the future. Members of the US intelligence community and academics also predicted that there would be more nuclear weapon states. Scholars especially assumed at this time that any state with the technical capacity, so the resources, the engineering abilities, and sufficient resources, material resources, would build their own bombs. And yet, as you said, Hannah, at the beginning, we're not in that world. Today, we have 9 nuclear armed states. We have the same number as 30 years ago, trading North Korea for South Africa. And so even though that JFK quotation I began with is often used to illustrate his concern about potential proliferation, I want to highlight the part where he says, unless we are successful. Unless we are successful, there may be 10 nuclear powers instead of 4, and by 1975, 15 or 20. And so I would argue, along with many others, that the international community has been quite successful in its efforts to stop the spread of nuclear weapons. Now, of course, the record is not perfect, but it has been effective, I would say. And as you mentioned, many scholars and practitioners do credit the Treaty on the Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons, we'll just refer to it as the NPT, as being a large contributor to this outcome. So I know that many of you on this call know this very well, but I do have some students here. So just to review, the NPT is the treaty that was negotiated primarily by the US and the Soviet Union in the 1960s. It allows 5 states to have nuclear weapons. Those are the 5 that had tested by January of 67, right? So that's the US, the Soviet Union, the UK, France, and China. All other states that would choose to join the treaty at that time, right, or at any time if they decided to, would have to join as non-nuclear weapon states. In exchange, these non-nuclear weapon states have access to peaceful nuclear technology or nuclear technology for peaceful purposes like energy generation or medical purposes or agricultural purposes. All non-nuclear weapon states in the treaty would also agree to nuclear safeguards with the International Atomic Energy Agency. And importantly, in Article 6 of the treaty, all members of the treaty, non-nuclear and nuclear alike, agreed to pursue good faith measures toward eventual disarmament. And that's something I'll come back later. And so this treaty that entered into force in 1970 has lasted for 52 years. It boasts membership of all but 5 states in the international system today. So we have India and Pakistan and Israel, nuclear weapon states that have never joined. North Korea, a nuclear weapons state that withdrew from the treaty in 2003, and then South Sudan, the newest member of the international system, has not joined the treaty. Okay, so this NPT was just the beginning though. As new dangers emerged or weaknesses in the treaty became apparent, the international community worked to forge new agreements, new groups to bolster the NPT's goals. And so I argue that all of this sort of web or this architecture of different treaties and agreements make up the nuclear non-proliferation regime. And I define that in the book as the set of institutions and activities aimed at curtailing the spread of nuclear weapons and dangerous nuclear material. Thus far, this treaty has, and this regime has endured through changing global power dynamics. It has overcome challenges from states that have violated their commitments as NPT members. And so my book asks why states adhere to the nuclear non-proliferation regime. We have an almost universal treaty. So why do states, even those without any nuclear technology or any interest in nuclear technology, join these agreements and then support this regime? And so the short answer here is that for decades, the US government has undertaken significant diplomatic effort to make the NPT and other regime agreements nearly universal. And so it's not just the universalization of the NPT, though, it's leading the international community in promoting adaptations to the regime, providing leadership to establish, for example, the Nuclear Suppliers Group in 1974, following India's nuclear explosion, or really providing strong leadership to establish the Model Additional Protocol Safeguards Agreement following revelations of Iraq's secret nuclear program in the 1990s. And so with the NPT, like many other institutions that the US helped create in the post-World War II era, the US sought universal membership. And it didn't necessarily need to, right? It could have just focused on states that had a plausible or realistic chance of developing nuclear technology, but the US really has pursued universal membership. And I argue that this regime should be considered part of the post-World War II global ordering project on par with other economic and security institutions. Now, you may be wondering at this point, what about the Soviet Union? There was the 2 superpowers during the Cold War. It was the US and the Soviet Union that negotiated this treaty largely together. And so in the book, I do argue that the Soviet Union cooperated with the United States, but that the US did play a singular role in promoting the regime. And I'm happy to talk in more detail about that in the Q&A. So then, if I'm arguing that the US has been the chief promoter of the regime, understanding states' adherence to these various elements, these various treaties and agreements, requires understanding how states respond to US tools of influence. And so as the most powerful state in the international system during the nuclear age to date, the US has had many tools with which to persuade other states to join these agreements. And so I argue that when there's a new agreement or activity, the US government requests all states join or cooperate initially by sending simple diplomatic requests. And this is what I call in the book low-cost diplomacy. And these are routine actions taken by the State Department, or at the time, the now defunct Arms Control and Disarmament Agency within the US. And if these initial requests don't work, the US moves on to higher cost diplomacy. That could be meetings or requests in person or by cable from the president or the vice president contacting his foreign counterpart. It could include possible inducements, and in very limited examples within this regime, we do see some coercion. And so what determines the specific, if these tools work or not with a given state, I theorize that that depends on a state's level of embeddedness within the larger US-led global ordering project. And I define embeddedness as the extent to which a state's policy preferences and political values align with those of the United States, right? So you can imagine some states have policy preferences that align, but not political values that align. So we can see this as sort of a 2x2 with some of the boxes more populated than others. But for the sake of simplicity, I categorize states as being highly embedded, moderately embedded, weakly embedded, or antagonistic. And so the more embedded the state, the easier it is for the US to persuade it to join agreements. So that means for US allies who largely share political values and policy preferences, it is going to be much easier for them to join. And then on the other end of the spectrum, we think of a Cuba or a North Korea, a Libya, harder to get those states in. And they might not join at all. Now, to test these ideas, I conducted case studies of states' decisions to join the NPT, to support indefinite extension of the NPT in 1995. Per one of the treaty's articles, all the membership of the NPT would come together 25 years after the treaty entered into force. It entered into force in 1970. And so 1995 was this decision point to say, is this treaty, are we going to continue having reviews after a certain number of years? Some states even said every 5 years, maybe every 25, or maybe the treaty should just last in perpetuity. And that's what the US argued for. And then I also look at decisions to conclude the Model Additional Protocol Safeguards Agreement. And I look at decision-making in Japan, in Egypt, in Indonesia, in Cuba, and South Africa at various periods. I'm happy to talk about any of those specific cases during the Q&A, but I wanted to just conclude with 3 quick takeaways from this book project. And the first is that global order making, creating order in the international system, goes beyond the initial creation of institutions. It entails promoting global rules year after year and leading the way when adaptations to rules are deemed necessary. So this goes against some literature in the field which suggests you need a hegemon or a powerful state to create an institution, but then it can continue on. And I argue, no, you need that powerful leadership going forward to sustain the regime. And I imagine that's true for other regimes, but it's particularly true for the non-proliferation regime. The second takeaway is that if the US continues to decline in relative terms, and that's if other states become increasingly materially powerful, so kind of shrinking the gap between themselves and the US, then the US is going to lose some of the leverage that it was afforded by its previous dominant position. So it's going to compete with other states for influence, and it might have a harder time persuading states to follow the rules that it prefers in the international system. And then finally, the nuclear and this follows on number 2, the nuclear non-proliferation regime will be affected by changes in the distribution of global power. The regime has survived under US hegemony, both in a bipolar system in the Cold War and a unipolar system after the Cold War. But I think it is possible that potential alternative global power arrangements like multipolarity could adversely affect the regime. And I'm happy to talk again more about that in Q&A. So I think I try to stick within my time, and I'm happy to talk more about the book.
Thank you, Rebecca. You very much stuck within the time limit. So I think we have a lot of scope for questions. Before I turn to the audience, I have actually a few questions I wanted to ask you. First of all, on the book, the Hegemon's Toolkit, you sort of laid out the steps that the United States would take in order to induce other states to join or support the regime with low-cost diplomacy, perhaps then higher-cost diplomacy and certain inducements, and perhaps in some extreme cases also forms of coercion. Would you say that that toolkit has sort of remained static over the decades? Has it changed? Has the mix changed? Have the specific tools changed? And are there sort of outliers to sort of that sequence of diplomatic engagement in the case studies that you examined?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I still think that kind of ordered approach is what the U.S. takes. I want to point out the coercion is not something like the U.S. is not engaged in coercing a country really to join the NPT in almost all cases. Where I saw instances of coercion, it was in the 1995 extension, where that was a time-bound, that decision had to be made in the spring of 1995. The US wanted all states to vote in favor of extending the treaty kind of forever, right? Not to have these rolling extensions or having to review the treaty again. And so in that case, we do see some instances where countries talked about being pressured. There's an example of one diplomat who actually quit during the course of the review and extension conference because his country changed positions to support the US. And he basically said, you have to ask my capital why this happened. So there were sort of examples of this, or people saying things like in the US government, like, this isn't one we're going to forget about, right? And so that's not that the US directly goes to these countries and that, it's not in the record where a diplomat is saying, if you don't do this, we'll take away X, Y, and Z. But because of the US's position of providing aid to many countries and providing many public goods in the international system, it does have a way of saying, be careful, we do this for you. So if this is something really important to us, this is one you want to pay attention to. I guess where I'm concerned is the US had kind of a unique ability and was, such a strong aid provider during the Cold War and after, that we now see China providing aid to countries, making economic and trade deals. We see this particularly in Africa, and that I think the US will not necessarily be as easy to say, we think this is really important, can you go along with us? I would assume that allies would still be on board, and even maybe more so in thinking about a potential kind of global competition of influence between the US and China. But I think other states, it might be more difficult. And this goes back, we saw this during the Cold War sometimes, where countries would kind of play, the non-aligned countries could play the Soviet Union and the US off each other, but we had the Soviet Union and the US largely cooperating in this area in a way that I'm not sure we're seeing right now.
That's great. Thanks, Rebecca. And I do want to ask a question that is sort of building directly on your last point and also on the three sort of takeaways with which you ended your presentation, which is, if you take stock now at the end of 2022, where do you see the main threats really to the nuclear non-proliferation regime globally going forward? And how do you see the role both of the United States, but then also of other major actors in the international system in responding to these threats?
Yeah, that's a great question. And a hard question. So as you know, my book argues that sustaining, expanding, and adapting the nuclear non-proliferation regime has required this great power leadership. And so we had cooperation between the US and the Soviet Union during the Cold War. The US has largely been able to maintain this role since the end of the Cold War. But now I would argue we're in this period of emerging nuclear multipolarity, right? So we have rising China, and Russia still has the most nuclear weapons of any state in the world. And so I do think what I said, this emerging nuclear multipolarity may be problematic for the regime. And I want to highlight that I've expanded on this argument with one of my co-authors, Stephen Herzog, in an article that came out this year in Contemporary Security Policy. And so we look at healthy regimes have certain factors, and we focus on widespread membership, the ability to adapt, enforcement of the rules, and perceptions of fairness. And this comes from literature on all different regimes, not just looking at non-proliferation. And I would argue all four of those factors are being undermined right now. So for example, with enforcement, China and Russia have not been interested in more sanctions on North Korea within the UN Security Council. they recently voted against the Board of Governors resolution at the International Atomic Energy Agency, talking about Iran's non-cooperation with the agency in terms of some of the things that they found there. And of course, I have to mention the US under the Trump administration left the Iran nuclear deal. So I think that is an egregious example of non-cooperation. So I don't want to just point the finger at the Russia and China here. I think that was hugely problematic for the regime, and it looks like we're not getting back there anytime soon. In terms of adaptability, we've seen the US and Adam Scheinman, who led the delegation for the US at the review conference in August, has talked about this idea of we need to make some kind of progress, political, if not binding, kind of progress on the withdrawal clause of the NPT. So the idea that North Korea was able to be a member of the NPT and gain access to this peaceful nuclear technology, and then to withdraw and use that same technology to then build a nuclear weapon, goes against the spirit of the treaty. And so what can be done about this? And this is something the US has talked about for at least a decade and doesn't seem to be getting much traction. So that would be an adaptation that we're not seeing come to fruition. Membership, I would argue the most important thing, or the most important aspect of the regime by which we need universal membership today is the additional protocol. And there are some significant holdouts. I don't think we see China and Russia pushing states that are holdouts, so Belarus or Egypt, to join. And that was also a contentious topic at the RevCon about the review conference, whether that should be the global safeguard standard or not. And then in terms of fairness, we'll go back to Article 6, disarmament. I don't think we're going to see progress on legally binding arms control anytime soon. We have the treaty on the treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons, the TPNW, where we really see this urgency about disarmament by much of the international community. And as we continue to not see progress in Article 6, I think that's only going to make that call stronger. And so we're seeing increasing numbers by China. We're seeing modernization in most of the other states. And so it's just really hard to make an argument at this point in time that the P5 are complying with Article 6 of the NPT or taking credible actions towards disarmament. There is talk of risk reduction, but again, I don't think that is going to kind of be seen as a very credible positive step in the eyes of those really pursuing disarmament. So I don't know if that piece can be put in the chat, but I think it's really helpful to this conversation to think about how this regime will last. I'd also point out that we've now had 2 review conferences without a consensus document, so we haven't had that before. I just broadly worry about just the lack of energy and sort of excitement about the NPT, and maybe even appreciation for the NPT. I went to the first meeting of states parties for the TPNW in Vienna this summer, and there was a lot of energy around that meeting, a lot of excitement for ways forward and how they're going to execute that treaty. And you just don't have that in the NPT. At the end of the review conference, there was a diplomat who said, why am I even here? What is the point of this? I should tell my leader that this isn't worth my time. And so I'm not worried about countries leaving en masse on the NPT, but I am worried that countries will maybe see it as not worth their time to be actively participating in these meetings and thinking about, how we strengthen this treaty for the future.
Thank you, Rebecca. And I do believe my colleagues just put the piece in the chat so everyone can see that. I have more questions I could ask, but I also see questions coming in from our audience. So I'll turn to those for a moment, and I encourage others to submit their questions if they wish. I'll start with a question by Kjölf Egeland, who says, well, Hanna already asked a version of this question, but I'm curious how the argument that you make in your book relates to structural factors like the Cold War or post-Cold War period. And he looks forward to reading the book. Perhaps you could take that one first.
Yeah, hi, Shov. Thank you for being here. This gets back to what I said about multipolarity. And the big question in this book is I start from a theory that says that great powers that have interests all around the globe, care more about preventing the emergence of new nuclear weapon states, right? They don't necessarily want to, become involved in a smaller conflict that becomes a nuclear conflict. They don't want to be deterred from action. I mean, I think we see this a little bit with North Korea. They don't want to be, we don't want to have North Koreas all over the world. I mean, we don't want that anyway, but particularly a great power strategically would see that as not to its benefit. And so if you take that argument and bring it to now, then I would think that China, as its global interests expand, Belt and Road is going almost all over the entire world, as its interests expand globally, that it would care just as much as the US about promoting non-proliferation. And yet we don't see that yet. We know that the US government has done a lot to try to engage with China on these issues. I think it's been particularly frustrating for the US. And so I guess the big question is there something unique about the US, or is this more structural, where eventually China is going to, as it increases in power and sees itself in that place, will it become this major stakeholder in the regime? And instead, I would say right now, I would see China and Russia almost engaging more like these antagonistic states that I talked about before, that are hampering further progress, whether that's promoting widespread membership in the additional protocol, or trying to adapt the regime, or pursuing arms control, right, to abide by Article 6. I mean, even though there's countries, the US, Russia, sought arms control for strategic reasons, they also would say that it was because of Article 6 when they were justifying or promoting these treaties, particularly in the US before Congress. And we don't see that either. So I'm concerned that as the US declines in relative power, there won't be this stakeholder. And I'm concerned that I would assume China would take that role, and we just haven't seen it. But if other people have thoughts on that, I'd love to hear it. Or Shul, we can talk about that another time.
Thanks for that, Rebecca. And sort of, I would say, if that decline in US power is sort of really panning out and there's no other stakeholders who assume that role, could we see a fragmentation of a global nuclear order? And if it is fragmentation, what does that mean, or how will that new order look like? Will it be multiple orders or something else? So I think that's sort of a question to ask. But we have another question coming in from Tom Sauer, who says, is the idea that the NPT has been and still is successful not a myth, especially since 2010 and maybe already before? What about the fact that most NPT RevCons failed, including the last two in 2015 and 2022? If the NPT had been successful, we would probably not have seen the arrival of the TPNW.
Hi, Tom. I was going to be able to debate this kind of issue with Tom in Montreal in the spring, and I'm sorry I won't be there to debate with you. But yeah, I think that's a really interesting point. Has this really been successful? And I would argue, yes, it has. And I think one thing that's so important with the NPT is that it's not like many treaties in the international system where states just join, but they join and then they're required to have safeguards with the International Atomic Energy Agency. And so I feel pretty confident in the safeguards, particularly the additional protocol, that if a country has that and they are taking actions that contravene their responsibilities and commitments under the NPT, that will be discovered by the international community, and the international community hopefully will be able to do something about it. I mean, that's another challenge of enforcement, but we have, it's not just cheap talk, in other words, right? We have those inspections. And the fact that at the first meeting of the states parties, almost universally, the statements made by countries in the TPNW was that this treaty is consistent with the NPT. And I think states are still making that argument. This is consistent. This isn't an alternative. This is helping kind of push towards progress on Article 6 of the NPT. But I do agree with you in the sense that it was concern about the long-term health of the NPT that did lead to the TPNW. So diplomats, particularly in Europe, who I've interviewed, came out of the 2005 NPT review conference. That was a conference without a consensus document. That's the one where the US said we no longer can abide by some of the 13 practical steps that had been agreed to in 2000, which was a huge accomplishment. And they said, and they thought, if we don't see progress on disarmament, this treaty might not last. And so that was, there was an NGO strain that moved forward from there. And eventually would be the umbrella organization of ICANN leading that way. And we had diplomats looking at that, and they would come together and help promote the humanitarian initiative and the TPNW. But I think the impetus for many diplomats was that this treaty needs progress on disarmament to last, and they wanted the NPT to last. I think I still do think the NPT, when we look at it historically in the nuclear age, has been quite successful, and that we do have a strong norm against proliferation today. I mean, we see that in the fact that countries are in nuclear weapons free zones, they're in the NPT, and they're in many in the TPNW.
Thanks for that, Rebecca. And Gregory Giles asks a question that directly builds on what you just said on the TPNW. He asks, and first of all, he says that he has his book directly next to him, and then asks how the TPNW impacts the United States' ability to continue exercising leadership over the NPT.
Yeah, that's a tough one. Hi, Greg. Greg is one of my former colleagues and friends. Thank you for having the book. I do think it complicates things to some extent, but I think that the way that the P5 and especially the P3, the US, France, and the UK have spoken about the treaty historically, or in the past few years, has not been helpful. We do see the Biden administration has stepped away from that a little bit. Bonnie Jenkins talked about, we're still not in favor of this treaty, but we are not going to speak about it as the previous two administrations in the US did. I think we can see at the review conference that the TPNW wasn't the issue, right, that stymied the conference. There was paragraphs in that draft document, the draft final document, that acknowledged that the treaty had entered into force and that it had its first meeting. There were references to the humanitarian impact of nuclear weapons. I think it is very difficult to do bridge building between the most staunch TPNW supporters, particularly in the NGO community, and those who believe that nuclear deterrence has made us safer. I think it's really hard. If the assumptions are just different. There's people that are arguing nuclear weapons inherently, their existence right now is making us less safe as we speak, right? There could be nuclear war. We're in a conflict right now where nuclear threats are being made. There could be miscalculations. There could be accidents, right? So those folks would argue we are inherently unsafe, less safe because of the existence of those weapons. And as long as they are in the posture that they are in, we are especially unsafe. And then there are those that say that posture and those nuclear weapons are actually making us safer right now. And so it's really hard, I think, to bring those groups together and to do bridge building. I am leading with Hassan Albatini and Stephen Herzog, a working group called Beyond Nuclear Deterrence. That is a MacArthur-funded initiative out of managing the atom at the Harvard Kennedy School. And we are going to be attempting to do some bridge building in this area and have dialogue between these two groups. I think probably US-Russia relations, I mean, it's hard to say, are US-Russia relationships more of a complicating factor? I think right now they are, with kind of prospects for engaging on next steps or treaties beyond New START. But Greg, this is again something that I'd like to hear more of what you think about that. I think we have many challenges, and that's one of them, but I don't think it's the most difficult one.
Yeah, and on US-Russia relations and the prospects for following on to New START, I think it was actually just reported 1 or 2 hours ago in the Russian press that unfortunately the Bilateral Consultative Commission, which was supposed to convene in Cairo this week between US and Russian negotiators, has apparently been cancelled. It's going to be postponed. That's sort of the scant reporting that we're hearing out of Moscow today. I'm unsure as to the reasons. I haven't seen any reporting on the reasons or how long that postponement might be, but the word is that that meeting is unfortunately not happening this week as many had hoped and anticipated. Rebecca, speaking about beyond deterrence, I think it's fitting to read Amir Mohageri's question to you now. He asks, well, if the NP regime collapses, what are the alternatives? Back to 1963 with multiple states developing nuclear weapons, will stable deterrence be possible in such a world? Another hard question.
Yeah, no, but Amir, that's a great question. Like, what are the alternatives? I don't think it's realistic to think that we could negotiate a new NPT today. I mean, even the additional protocol, which was negotiated in the 1990s, I think was a unique period of US-Russia cooperation, or at least in that case, the US took the lead on negotiating that with many states that had that have nuclear infrastructure, and Germany kind of led those states in negotiating with the US. We didn't see Russia trying to stop the US or stymie the process in any way. So I even don't think we could negotiate the additional protocol today, let alone the NPT. And so for that reason, I think it's especially important, as much as it gets criticized, or we didn't, we had a failed review conference. I do think the NPT, and I hope my book makes clear that this is a treaty, whether you're frustrated with it or not, that we should appreciate for what it's done and for the norms that it's created and for the safeguards that it's created, and that it's really, I think, unlikely that you could do this today. And if it does kind of dissolve, or if countries become less interested, I think we could unfortunately be in a world where some countries see proliferation by certain states more advantageous to them. So maybe Russia thinks, oh, it's okay if Iran gets nuclear weapons. I mean, I'm not saying they think this now, but there's precedent for this. There were some in the State Department or in the Nixon administration during that time when the US was thought to be in decline, where there were people who wrote memos saying, well, why shouldn't we have Japan get nuclear weapons? Wouldn't that be beneficial, an ally in a difficult region having nuclear weapons? And that's an anomalous position in the US government. Most, presidents since then, all presidents since then, have wanted to stop proliferation and have perceived proliferation as a problem, whether it is by an ally or adversary or some state in between. But I wonder if the NPT goes away, if there'd be a race to say, well, we want states on our side to have these weapons, if we would go back to that kind of thinking, which I think could be very dangerous. And I'm not saying the US would think that, but is it possible Russia would think that, or China would think that, or a future leader would think that, if we don't have the confidence that the NPT provides by having safeguards for states, in which states can think, I'm confident my neighbor is not going to proliferate, or if they do, that I'm going to be warned and the international community will have time to do something about it because of safeguards.
Thanks, Rebecca. In terms of where we're headed in the future, we have another variation of that question posed by Paul Ingram, which I'll read out to you. He asks, could the behavior of some of the states you describe, like Russia and China in relation to North Korea, illustrate the weaknesses of the current regime and potential evolution or revolution towards a stronger future regime, new NPT or TPNW? Could this move towards multipolarity actually be more stable in the future if these states are given more responsibility in the structure of the regime? So in other words, perhaps the existing structures are seen as US instruments, and the onus is on the US to more genuinely bring in other actors into the management, and that could then create an actually more stable structure.
Thank you, Paul. That's a really interesting question. I mean, I noticed the word you use, if they are given more responsibility, and I guess I'm saying, why aren't these countries taking more responsibility? And so I guess an assumption of your question is, if the US somehow needs to move over and allow Russia or allow China. And I get the sense that the US has tried to do that, right? The US has tried to say to China, take more responsibility for what is happening in your backyard with North Korea. I mean, China doesn't want a war in North Korea. They don't want a bunch, that's millions of refugees coming across the border and breeding potential instability in that region of China. So I guess I would like to see what you're saying. I think, yes, as we get to more multipolarity, we do know that more players makes it harder to cooperate. But yes, ideally, we would have a place where all three of these powers see themselves as stakeholders, maybe responsible for different states. And we did see that a little bit in the Cold War. So when the Soviet Union saw that South Africa might be preparing, right, a nuclear test, they went to the US and said, you have more influence here, talk to them, and they were able to cooperate, and that test didn't happen at that time. And so, yes, I guess I'd like to see that level of cooperation, but I don't see how the US cedes power without knowing that another state, or cedes any responsibility for the regime without knowing that other states are going to fill that gap. And I just don't see their interest. I think you're right, or right in the sense that maybe this is seen too much as a part of the US-led order, and the US should try hard to say this is part of global security. And again, it's not a liberal, it's not like part of, it's not as liberal as other aspects of the US established global order, right? So I think there's an argument to be made that this is not the same as different rules that the US has tried to promote about human rights, or even certain rules about trade, that there is an opportunity to frame this as much more of a global public good than something the US is promoting. I just, in practice, diplomatically, I'm not sure what that would look like, but it's certainly an idea to explore.
Thanks, Rebecca. Speaking about the US's role and the US's ability or willingness to bring in other states more into the management, I do want to ask you one of my own questions about sort of the US and multilateralism, sort of a bit more broadly. So recently, during the Trump administration, we saw the US to some extent turning away from multilateralism, and you noted in your remarks the US walking away from the JCPOA as one example. Now, first of all, I want to ask you what we saw in those years. Can you assess what the impact has been and might be in the future on the nuclear non-proliferation regime? And do you think this was a sort of temporary glitch, and we now sort of see a return to the normal, to sort of longer standing patterns? Or do you think this was perhaps indicative of some broader trends in US policies and sort of engagement with the regime?
Yeah, that's a tough question. I mean, that would be a really interesting polling question to do, for example, in US amongst the populations in US allies, right? To see if they see this as a trend or something that's an anomaly. And so, of course, yes, Trump did reject multilateralism, I would argue, to an unprecedented degree, pulling out of the JCPOA, and just cooperation in general. I mean, I was in Brussels at the beginning, when actually about the time he was inaugurated, when he made that quote, when he said that quote about NATO being obsolete, right? So this very much, and there's negative talk about the UN at different times. And so on the one hand, I could see members of the international community drawing a line from the 2003 war in Iraq under the George W. Bush administration and the perceived unilateralism of that action. Of course, there was a coalition, but it was seen as the US taking unilateral action in large part because the US did not get that final UN Security Council approval for the use of force, right? And the UN Security Council is supposed to be the arbiter of legitimate use of force in the international system. And so I think that there is a way that you could draw a line from 2003 to Trump. Trump is running again. Of course, there is, I think, a bigger break in the Republican Party than there was before, and there's people that don't necessarily think it was wise for him to announce. But so I think on that side, I can see reason for observers to worry about the streak in U.S. policy. But on the other hand, I think Russia's war in Ukraine has united the West and illustrated the value to the U.S. of working in concert with other states. I think the rise of China and concerns about conflicts with China over Taiwan, over other issue areas will probably do the same in uniting the West. And so I think it's important that the US does keep, I think the US will be stronger for continuing to promote multilateralism. And also there's just global problems, as you know, that we can't solve. I mean, we can't solve climate change. We can't solve things related to addressing pandemics without working together, and non-proliferation. And I think the US should keep espousing values and espousing its values, its political values, particularly those that are contradicted by the political regimes in Russia and China. I recently read the John Eikenberry piece in Foreign Affairs, where he's arguing for the continued role of the US and the West in promoting global order and saying that the US is still very necessary. And I think he's right. But I think the US also has to kind of clean up certain things at home to be able to be in that position to be promoting those values. And that is something, I mean, that's not just a trend in the US, but a trend we're seeing around the world with this democratic slide. But that's concerning. So I hope that the US will give our foreign counterparts a reason to think that that was an aberration and that we're back. I know the Biden administration has said we're back, but again, we have 4-year terms, right? So we'll see. Hopefully we continue that, because I think it's vital to so many things that we face, so many challenges as an international system.
Great, thanks, Rebecca. We have a few more questions coming in. The next one is on the TPNW specifically by Emma Crozier. I apologize if I mispronounced that name. So the question is, do you think the TPNW has legitimate capability to develop and make progress without Russia, US, and China, 3 major powers with conflicting interests?
Thank you, Emma. Emma's one of my great students at USM, so thank you for being here and asking a good question. Yes, I certainly do. I've written about this. I see the TPNW as promoting a norm against the possession of nuclear weapons, but also performing kind of a role in educating the public, particularly the humanitarian initiative that helped lead the way to negotiating that treaty. I mean, I think the average public for many years has not thought a lot about nuclear weapons, and yet, you know, they still existed with the end of the Cold War. There's still something like 13,000 nuclear weapons in the world today. And so to the extent that the TPNW can raise awareness about the existence of these weapons, the effects of these weapons, what they do both, you know, on the level of the individual body, but also to the environment. I often like to plug, I'm going to forget the name of the book, the recent book that looks at the Marshall Islands, seeing if I have it on my shelf, that kind of shows the terrible both human impact, but also the environmental impact of the testing of these weapons on the Marshall Islands, places that people still cannot live now and decades later, right? So the environmental impact of certain types of tests is huge for use. And so I think raising that awareness is really important. But I mean, the TPNW is moving ahead. It has many groups looking forward to how the treaty will actually work in practice. And I think all of that kind of nuts and bolts practicality is important. But to me, the role is really educating the public and creating this norm against possession, which I think, depending on world events, could take hold.
Thank you, Rebecca. We have Mark Goodman asking about the P5 process, whether you have any comments on the P5 process, where you see it today, what elements have been most or least constructive, and what you would advise the P5 to do in the future.
Yes, I wish that right now we were having a more constructive P5 process. Just from my observations, and this is very much from the outside, I am not seeing a lot going on with the P5. In the past, we had a lot more P5 unity going into review conferences that we didn't have this year. Obviously, the P5 statement that was released January 3rd, with reiterating the Reagan-Gorbachev statement that nuclear war cannot be won and should never be fought, I think mattered, but then it was undermined by Russia going to war in Ukraine and issuing nuclear threats. So maybe an actual nuclear war shouldn't be fought, but Russia was illustrating the potential value of nuclear threats to try to deter countries from helping Ukraine. And so, I mean, I would like to see the P5 do more with this risk reduction to show that we recognize the humanitarian impact of nuclear weapons. We recognize that if an accident or miscalculation were to happen, that it would be extremely detrimental. And for those reasons, we are taking these steps as the P5 to reduce our risk. It's hard right now to see like really good outcomes coming out of the P5 when you have US and China on one side not being very helpful when it comes to Iran or North Korea, and then the P3 on the other. I think it could be a very valuable forum, and I know Heather Williams, when she was at King's, had some, and I think will continue on this work, but had workshops on the P5 where I remember leaving feeling very positive and kind of excited about what the potential for the P5 could be. And I think it is important that these countries, as the nuclear weapon states in the NPT, work to make sure the NPT stays legitimate, and that the meetings, that countries do come away from these meetings feel like constructive work is happening. I think that's really important. but I don't have any special insight into what's going on, particularly now with the P5 process.
Thanks, Rebecca. So we do have a few minutes left for this webinar, so I encourage attendees to post further questions through the Q&A function if they wish. I see another question by my colleague Nikolai Sokov, which I'll post to you in a second. But we've talked a lot about sort of today and the broader regime and the TPNW, and I do want to bring the conversation back to your book for one more moment and ask you sort of two questions about the book specifically. So just curious, what alternative explanations did you sort of examine in the book in terms of what explains the success of the regime over time, besides the leading role of the United States and its diplomacy? So what are sort of alternative explanations, and how relevant are they for accounting for the outcome? And then in conducting your case studies and conducting the work for the book, was there anything you found that struck you as particularly surprising, as counterintuitive, something where you were like, wow, I did not expect to find that?
Yeah, thank you for those questions. So I did look at alternative explanations, of course, as I compared kind of my argument to US leadership, because US leadership has been and the US role of the world has been kind of so pervasive in the post-World War II order. Sometimes it's hard to kind of parse away what is exactly an alternate explanation versus mine. But I did look at broadly if just security concerns were what made a country decide either to remain outside the NPT or to join the NPT, right? So outside because they might want to proliferate, or inside because they wanted to solve that security dilemma potentially with neighbors, that, oh, if my neighbors are joining, I will join and I will have confidence that they are not going to proliferate, so I don't need to. I also looked at this idea that comes from Celia Albin, which she looks at the importance of fairness in international agreements. And this is an argument that you see a lot regarding Article 4 and Article 6 of the NPT. So the peaceful nuclear security and access to peaceful nuclear technology and to disarmament. So the idea being that countries will be more likely to join aspects of the agreement when they think the agreement is fair. And so when they think that all parties are living up to their parts of the bargain. And so by that argument, I would expect to see countries holding out for more disarmament progress, or being more likely to join when they are seeing nuclear reductions. I didn't really see that. I didn't see evidence of that. Often the US was able to use the supply of nuclear technology to get countries further embedded in the regime. And I have a paper on that called Supply to Deny, which looks at different cases where the US was able to get countries in because of the promise of supply. And there were times where there was countries that said this isn't fair, and yet they were still joining. So I don't see that as being the definitive factor. I do talk about in the conclusion that fairness and the lack of fairness has helped lead to the TPNW and may be more of a factor over time. I also looked at Attila Soligin's argument, where she argues that countries that are more open to the global economy and trade are more likely to join the NPT because they want to be kind of good standing members of the international community, and rejecting nuclear weapons and then potentially joining the NPT is part of that process of those countries kind of being good global citizens that'll be open to trade. And while I think her argument does apply to certain states, it doesn't necessarily get at the timing. So for example, she writes in her book about Japan. Yes, trade did matter to Japan, but I don't think it helps explain the particular timing of Japan's joining the NPT. Japan is a bit of an outlier in my story, in the sense that you would have thought it would have joined sooner. It's not fully in until 1976, but it didn't join until the US made it very clear that it was in the US interest. The Nixon administration had waffled about that and not been very clear until the US said, this is going to be necessary for global nuclear supply and that you have this industry. So in the end, even though it was delayed, there are aspects of the theory that fit that case. And you'll see, I'm very honest in the book where I don't think that my theory holds up against the others, or where I think those theories also apply. But I think overall, the big picture story is that the role of the US is the most important in understanding all these various outcomes. In terms of case studies, I think one that's particularly interesting is looking at Cuba. Cuba is the last state to have joined the NPT. They joined in the early 2000s during the time that the US was threatening to go to war in Iraq over suspected secret WMD programs, right? Nuclear, bio, and chemical. And so we see that in the spring of 2002, members of the Bush administration accuse Cuba of having a secret biological weapons program. That's said in Congress, that's said in events at think tanks around in DC. And we see that by that, and that continues, and we see that by that fall, Cuba wants to join the NPT and conclude a safeguards agreement. At the time, Cuba had very little nuclear material, and so it could have had something called a small quantities protocol, where the IAEA inspectors don't come in because there's so little nuclear material, but they insisted at the time that they wanted inspectors, and they concluded an additional protocol. So I see them really at that time seeking transparency and saying, we want to be open, we want to allow the international community to come in. Even though it was nuclear and not bio, I see this as a sign that they were trying to show that they were not doing anything nefarious as the US was accusing them of. We also see in that winter that they start doing drills, civilian kind of safety drills and drills that you would do in the lead up to a potential conflict. So I do think they thought that there was some credible threat that, as the US was talking about going into Iraq to, disarm the Saddam Hussein regime, that Cuba thought it could be next as a rogue state that doesn't get along with the US, and that they quickly joined. And so that is a story that I hadn't read before. And so I think, unfortunately, that might be an example of the potential threat of conflict of another leading to a country to join elements of the regime. And so I found that to be a particularly interesting story.
Thank you for that, Rebecca. I do want to come to the question by my colleague, Nikolai Sokov now, who sort of poses a question about the broader health of the non-proliferation regime more broadly. So he asks you to comment on the role of international organizations in the non-proliferation regimes in plural, and how they fare these days. He says, we see that the OPCW, for instance, is in a worsening crisis, whereas the IAEA seems to function well and reasonably smoothly. So how do you see those different institutions faring today?
Yeah, I mean, I'm certainly not an expert on chemical weapons. I think, obviously, Syria's use of chemical weapons, then joining the treaty, saying it would get rid of the chemical weapons and then using them again, has been a problem for the Chemical Weapons Convention. Syria is protected at the UN Security Council by Russia. So I think that that kind of serves to undermine both that organization, but also the Security Council to some extent, right? That more can't be done in this area. I think the danger for all of these organizations is they become politicized. I think in Russia and China pushing back sometimes on the IAEA, we see a sense of this, but I still think it's not as bad as it could be, and that the IAEA, it's important for it to remain a neutral organization that is not seen as operating, under the auspices of any one state, but that it is this autonomous organization with its particular mission. But I do think the politicized, I'm not going to say that word, these organizations becoming politicized is going to be a problem. And it maybe gets back to what we were talking about before, where different spheres look at these issues separately, and we don't have this kind of global multilateral approach.
Thanks, Rebecca. And speaking about sort of different institutions, we have another question that just came in from Professor Daya Schenker, who asks about the role of the CTBT in terms of contributing to nuclear non-proliferation today. What's your assessment there?
Yeah, so the CTBT was something I addressed in the book, because it's hard to make this argument that the US has led the development of these various treaties and organizations and promoted membership. And then, of course, we know that the US Senate voted to not join, or not to give it its advice and consent to the CTBT in 1999. And so it is somewhat unique in this story. Nonetheless, the US, I would argue, was very important to getting the CTBT negotiated in the first place, right? This is something that states have long wanted in the international system. I mean, you know, as before the NPT was even negotiated, right? There was this hope that we could end nuclear testing as people began to realize the effects of radiation and what nuclear testing meant for people in the environment. So the US was instrumental, I would argue, in getting it to the point that it was able to be negotiated and adopted. And I would also highlight that the US provides a lot of funding to the international monitoring system, and that even though the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty has not entered into force, the international monitoring system is a huge accomplishment to have these sensors, different types of sensors all around the world, sensing potential nuclear explosions, but also helping with things like tsunamis and earthquakes, that it is still valuable. I think it is problematic that it hasn't entered into force, and I would like to see the US take leadership on, and China taking leadership and putting this and ratifying the treaty, right? The US has signed but not ratified. And I think the CTB is kind of one of the building blocks. A fissile material cutoff treaty is another building block that would kind of push this regime forward. The nuclear non-proliferation regime forward. I took the point that there are many non-proliferation regimes to include other types of weapons. Yeah, I mean, I hope the US and China can come to some agreement on this eventually. It doesn't seem to be a priority right now. And even when there have been administrations like the Obama administration in favor of the treaty, the Senate, with the tight split that we have and the polarization that we have, it doesn't seem likely that a US president will bring that up soon. It probably, I mean, like many treaties, it will probably be easier for a Republican president to bring it up, which we've seen in the past. But it's still a very important treaty, an important organization that has, the vast majority of states in the international system as part of it.
Thanks, Rebecca. We have another big question towards the end about a topic that we haven't addressed so much, which is climate change. Sunday Make asks, as we see more effects of climate change, could that have an effect on the NPT going forward?
Oh, Sunday. Sunday is also one of my students, Sunday Maker. That's a tough question, Sunday. I mean, I do think that as we care more about, and globally, we care more about the environment, it is hard to square caring a lot about the environment with any kind of nuclear testing and potential for nuclear use and accidents, just with the devastation, particularly of any kind of underwater or ground test on the ground, in terms of what that does. I mean, I would like to see kind of these norms overlapping over time, potentially. I think one of the challenges is, in general, the different communities that advocate for different things tend to be pretty siloed. You're someone who cares most about climate and you devote your time to that, and that's great. But can we get a broader, more intersectional group of people advocating for these things, right? So, and we do see in this country groups reaching out to groups that focus on issues of race, the climate, because there are intersections between all of these issues, climate justice, racial justice. We know that nuclear weapons testing affected populations that were not, that were often on the periphery of the countries where they were tested, or they were tested in the periphery of a completely different country. And so there's a lot to be said for climate justice, nuclear justice, and I think kind of racial justice, or to be perceived hand in hand. But I think how that happens in practice is challenging. But good question, Sunday.
Thank you, Rebecca. I have another question here from my colleague, Louis Reitman, who is with me at the VCDNP. He asks how you see the distinction between quote unquote responsible and irresponsible nuclear weapon states, which the UK and the US tend to emphasize. Do you find that to be a meaningful differentiation that should matter to TPNW supporters?
Ooh, good question. I mean, I think, yes, the US and the UK and France would say that they are responsible nuclear weapon states in their postures, but then you can see how other people would look at the US alert posture, and they could categorize that as irresponsible, right? So I think, and actually I worked on a project on this years ago, thinking about what are the factors that we would call responsible. And I think there are many things that those P3 do, and that includes not threatening nuclear use. Unfortunately, we did have the Trump administration, I think, over Twitter engaging in some nuclear threats. I think doing it in the course of a war, though, is different. So I think I'm not sure that differentiation matters to folks who want to get rid of all nuclear weapons, and it's seen as irresponsible as having them at all. I do think amongst other states that maybe rely on nuclear deterrence or extended nuclear deterrence, they do see a qualitative difference between the way they approach their weapons and other countries. But then, I mean, look at China having, up until now, kind of quite a small nuclear deterrent, right? Is that more responsible than having thousands and thousands? But again, if they're increasing, then is that less responsible? I think there are ways to set kind of criteria for that, but there's going to be a division between those who support nuclear deterrence and those who support nuclear disarmament.
Thanks, Rebecca. I do want to point out to the audience that we're sort of coming up soon in 8 minutes to the end of our webinar. So this is a last question to pose, last chance to pose any questions into the Q&A if you have any. Paul Ingram just came back with another question, which I want to read out to you, Rebecca. He asks whether all international regimes require a hegemon to be established and driven as is described in your book. Or is this contextual to the specifics of the type of regime that control WMD in a discriminatory manner as the NPT does? Are we limiting our imagination to the examples that we choose to focus on rather than using foresight to imagine alternative realities? So this is another broad question about sort of the nature of regimes and what might be possible in the future.
Yeah, good question. I mean, I think it requires a hegemon to be there at the beginning if you want the hegemon to be participating at the beginning, right? You can imagine a treaty, a landmine treaty or cluster munitions treaty. I can imagine the US eventually in a future world deciding to join those treaties because of normative pressure or because just fewer companies are making those weapons, or in the US case, some kind of resolution of between North and South Korea. And so that method of change where you don't have a hegemon leading is you get a critical number of states to promote this norm, and you hope that norm takes hold and continues to be strong, and eventually countries feel pressure to abide by that norm, right? It becomes kind of inculcated or entrenched in the international system. So I do think that's possible, but if you want to have a hegemon there right from the beginning, and I mean, they have to see it as in their interest. And so, I don't see how the NPT could have been established at the time without some kind of special category for the US and the Soviet Union, given their role in it. And of course, if you can fund if smaller powers or medium-sized powers, middle powers took leadership on something that was of interest to the US or interested to a hegemon, I imagine they could join. I just think often once you have a great power involved that they tend to set the agenda or kind of have greater, honestly, diplomatic strength to engage on those issues. So I think that is possible. And yes, we wouldn't want to limit our imagination to just saying the hegemons, but in terms of, it was a unique historical period, of course, after World War II, where the US did have this outsized power and have ideas and motivation to kind of shape the international system moving forward to prevent something like World War II from happening again. And we do know that many of those, and I'd point to Carla Norloff's book about this, many of the both economic and security organizations created then, you know, did benefit the US. And I would argue the US has had outsized benefits from those institutions.
Thanks, Rebecca. I see no further questions from our audience, so I want to ask you one final question before we conclude. And that question is sort of more specifically about the consequences of Russia's war against Ukraine for the nuclear non-proliferation regime. So I feel this war has sort of created a debate in our field as to the prospect of proliferation cascades. There are those who were alarmist pretty early on, saying that this conventional war waged by a nuclear weapon state against a non-nuclear weapon state under sort of a nuclear blackmail will make other actors in the international community at least to seek a nuclear, what's considered a nuclear hedge, because they will calculate that existing in this world without a nuclear hedge is a dangerous business. And then there are other scholars, like for instance, Nicholas Miller, who have sort of argued against this alarmism and sort of said it's not a foregone conclusion. And there's all these different reasons as to why we might not see proliferation cascades. Yeah. I just wanted to ask you about your take on this debate and sort of where you would position yourself.
Yeah, if you're interested in this question, I'm going to be in a similar kind of Zoom event with Nick Miller, Eric Brewer from NTI, and Tristan Volpe on this, because they've written on this question. I mean, I tended to think that the narrative that we're going to see these cascades and increase in proliferation overblown. As long as we do have this regime and that we have the US supporting this regime to the extent it does, it's hard for me to imagine states wanting to be like a North Korea or what Iran is dealing with right now. Now, you said a nuclear hedge, and so I think that's a more kind of nuanced and interesting point, right? There's a difference between saying, oh, we're going to build reactors for nuclear energy, knowing that it's potential that you could use spent fuel to have fissile material. But I think in terms of out and out proliferation, I don't see that being something that most states would find in their interest. I mean, I am worried that Saudi Arabia, if Iran gets nuclear weapons, I mean, the leader has stated we will get nuclear weapons if Iran goes nuclear. So if Iran became an overt nuclear weapons state instead of having a hedge, I'd be concerned about that. And of course, there are states that already have hedges in the international system based on their fissile material and their ability to either enrich or enrich uranium or reprocess plutonium. So I tend to think that's overblown. I almost worried. So Secretary of Defense Austin just recently made a statement that countries are going to want nuclear weapons. I think he said something like it's going to give them a hunting license. So countries that maybe want to be in Russia's position, not just countries that don't want to be in Ukraine's position. And I kind of think that language is unfortunate. It's like we want to have some warning about proliferation, but at the same time, I almost think, does that serve as some sort of, not justification, but legitimization of that action? And I think instead we should just be condemning that action of using a nuclear weapon to invade, and that hopefully this comes out with Russia looking like it is not better off for having done this, right? And it is punished for taking this action and making these nuclear threats.
Well, I think that's a great wrap. I do want to thank you so much for joining us today and discussing your new book. It's certainly given me a lot of appetite to get the book and to read it. So thank you so much for joining us. Thank you also for all our participants. Great questions that were posed during the discussion. And yes, we look forward to hosting you at the VCDNP to our next webinar in the not too distant future. Thank you.
Thank you for having me.